Lights go dark. Fortunes whisper. Someone wanted this lighthouse silent. Welcome to the Silent Clue Works. I am your host, Echo of Silence. Comment where you're watching from. Your voices matter. Grateful to have you here. Let's begin. It was a Thursday morning in October, and I was sitting at my desk in the office trying to make sense of Fritz's grocery receipts when the doorbell rang with the kind of persistence that suggested either a process server with a sense of humor or a client with money to burn. Since we could use either the entertainment or the fee, I got up and went to the front door. Through the one-way glass, I saw a woman in her 40s, well dressed in the kind of navy suit that whispers expensive instead of shouting it. She had steel gray hair pulled back in a way that meant business, and she was holding a briefcase like it contained the crown jewels, or at least something worth stealing. I opened the door and gave her my professional smile. She introduced herself as Victoria Marsh, senior partner at Marsh, Kellerman and Associates, maritime law specialists. She said she needed to speak with Nero Wolfe about a matter involving one of her clients, and from the way she said it, I gathered that the client had either done something spectacularly stupid or had something spectacularly stupid done to him. I told her Wolfe would be down from the plant rooms at 11 and invited her in. She accepted coffee, which Fritz brought on the good china, and settled into the red leather chair in the office like she planned to stay a while. At 11 sharp, I heard the elevator, followed by Wolfe's measured tread in the hall. He entered the office, navigated around his desk with the careful precision of a battleship docking, and lowered himself into his custom-made chair. He glanced at the orchid Fritz had placed on his desk, then at me with raised eyebrows. I made the introductions and stepped back to watch the show. Ms. Marsh wasted no time on pleasantries. She said her firm represented the estate of Harrison Blackwood, who until 3 weeks ago had been the owner and operator of Blackwood Shipping, a company that managed cargo routes along the eastern seaboard. Blackwood had been something of an eccentric, she explained. He had purchased a decommissioned lighthouse on a small island off the coast of Maine and converted it into his private residence and business headquarters. He lived there alone except for a housekeeper who came twice a week, conducting his business by radio and satellite phone, claiming that the isolation helped him think clearly about complex shipping schedules and maritime regulations. Wolfe's eyes had closed to slits, which meant he was listening despite looking like he was napping. Ms. Marsh continued. 3 weeks ago, Blackwood had failed to respond to his usual morning radio check with his dispatcher. When the Coast Guard investigated, they found the lighthouse empty. Blackwood's personal effects were undisturbed. His boat was tied at the dock, but Blackwood himself was nowhere to be found. The official conclusion was that he had fallen from the rocks during his evening walk and been swept out to sea, though no body had been recovered. That would have been the end of it, she said, except for what happened 5 days ago. She opened her briefcase and produced a manila envelope. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper with a message typed in block letters. The message read, "Harrison Blackwood did not fall. He was pushed. The lighthouse saw everything. Ask the right questions or the truth dies with the tide." Wolfe opened his eyes and regarded the paper without touching it. He asked if there had been any demands for money. Ms. Marsh shook her head. No demands, no signature, no return address. The envelope had been delivered to her office by messenger, but the messenger service had no record of who had hired them or paid for the delivery. Someone had left cash and the envelope at their office, with instructions to deliver it to her personally. She said the problem was that Blackwood's will left everything to his nephew, Robert Blackwood, who was eager to sell the shipping company and the lighthouse property to a development consortium. The sale was scheduled to close in 2 weeks. But if there was any suggestion that Harrison Blackwood had been murdered, the sale would be delayed indefinitely while the police reinvestigated. Robert Blackwood was pressuring her to ignore the anonymous letter, but she had ethical obligations that prevented her from simply discarding evidence of potential criminal activity. Wolfe picked up his beer glass, which Fritz had silently delivered, and took a slow sip. He asked why she had come to him instead of taking the letter directly to the police. She said that if the letter was genuine, she needed to know before she involved law enforcement. If it was a hoax or an attempt to delay the property sale for some other reason, she needed to know that too. She needed an independent investigation that could determine the credibility of the claim without triggering a public scandal that might destroy the value of the estate. Wolfe set down his glass and looked at her steadily. He said that missing persons cases were tedious and usually unsolvable, and that anonymous letters were typically the work of cranks or blackmailers. Furthermore, he said, he did not leave his house, and effective investigation of a lighthouse on an island would require considerable travel. Ms. Marsh nodded and said she understood his limitations. Then she mentioned that Harrison Blackwood had been not only a shipping magnate but also a collector of rare foods. His lighthouse had contained what was reportedly one of the finest private wine cellars on the East Coast, along with a collection of imported delicacies that included several items she believed might interest Wolfe's chef. The development consortium planned to auction off the contents before demolishing the lighthouse to build a resort hotel. Wolfe's expression didn't change, but I saw his fingers tighten slightly on his beer glass. He asked for specifics about the food collection. She consulted her notes and mentioned aged cheeses from remote alpine villages, vintage wines from defunct French vineyards, and a selection of rare spices, including what the inventory described as pre-war Spanish saffron of extraordinary quality. Wolfe was quiet for a long moment, and I could practically see him weighing his principles against his palate. Finally, he said he would accept the case on his standard terms, with the understanding that he would investigate the letter and the circumstances of Harrison Blackwood's disappearance, but could not guarantee any particular outcome. After she left, having agreed to the fee and promised to provide all relevant documents, Wolfe sat motionless for several minutes. Then he told me to call Saul Panzer and to prepare for a trip to Maine. I asked if he was really taking a case because someone had threatened a wine cellar. He said that civilization was a fragile thing, and that allowing good food to be destroyed by developers was a form of barbarism that demanded resistance. I didn't argue with that logic, partly because it made sense and partly because $50,000 would buy a lot of groceries. The next morning I was packing a suitcase while Fritz watched from the doorway with the expression of a man whose favorite nephew had announced plans to join the circus. When I told him I was flying to Maine to investigate a lighthouse, he made a sound that suggested this was exactly the kind of foolishness he had come to expect from Americans. Wolfe had given me my marching orders over breakfast, delivered between bites of his coddled eggs with the precision of a general briefing his scouts. I was to examine the lighthouse thoroughly, photograph everything including the wine cellar, and interview anyone who had known Harrison Blackwood. Most importantly, I was to pay attention to details that others might consider insignificant, because as Wolfe put it, the truth often hides in the trivial. By 10 o'clock I was at LaGuardia with a briefcase full of documents that Victoria Marsh had messengered over the previous evening. The file included Coast Guard reports, insurance papers, and a list of people connected to Blackwood and his business. The key players made an interesting collection. There was Robert Blackwood, the nephew and heir, described in the legal papers as a marketing consultant with expensive tastes and limited income. His fiancée, Lila Trent, ran a public relations firm that specialized in crisis management for wealthy clients. Emil Caro had been Blackwood's operations manager for 15 years, handling the day-to-day business of the shipping company from an office in Portland. Mrs. Agnes Doyle was the housekeeper who had worked for Blackwood twice a week for the past 5 years. And Marcus Hellman represented the development consortium that wanted to turn the lighthouse into a luxury resort. The flight to Portland gave me time to study the Coast Guard report, which was thorough but uninspiring. Harrison Blackwood had been reported missing when he failed to respond to his usual morning radio check with Emil Caro. The Coast Guard had found the lighthouse empty, with no signs of struggle or disturbance. Blackwood's personal effects were in place, his boat was tied at the dock, and there were no witnesses to whatever had happened. The official conclusion was accidental death, probably a fall from the rocks during Blackwood's evening walk, with the body swept out to sea by the tide. It was neat, logical, and completely unsatisfying to anyone who believed that millionaires don't usually vanish without leaving better clues. Portland turned out to be a working harbor dressed up for tourists, with lobster boats sharing dock space with pleasure craft and the smell of salt and diesel hanging in the air like a maritime perfume. I found the harbor master's office and introduced myself to a weathered man named Captain Duggan, who looked like he had been carved from driftwood and seasoned in nor'easters. When I explained that I was investigating Blackwood's disappearance on behalf of the estate, he gave me the kind of look that suggested he was calculating whether I was worth the effort of conversation. Duggan said that Blackwood had been a strange one, keeping to himself and running his shipping empire from that rock like some kind of hermit king. But he paid his bills and never caused trouble, which counted for something in Duggan's book. The lighthouse island was about 3 miles offshore, and Blackwood had made the crossing in a 24-foot motorboat whenever he needed supplies or had business on the mainland. The boat was still tied up at the island dock because nobody had figured out what to do with it yet. Duggan agreed to take me out there in his launch, but warned me that the weather was turning and I shouldn't plan on staying long. An hour later, we were cutting through choppy gray water toward a rocky outcrop that rose from the sea like a monument to solitude. The lighthouse stood at the highest point, a white tower connected to a 2-story keeper's house by a covered walkway. The whole structure had the kind of wind-swept loneliness that made me understand why someone might choose to live there if they valued privacy over convenience. Duggan brought his launch alongside a wooden dock that looked sturdy despite its obvious age, and I climbed out with my briefcase and camera. He said he would be back in 3 hours and advised me not to fall off any rocks because he wasn't in the mood for a rescue operation. The front door of the keeper's house was locked, but Victoria Marsh had provided me with a key. Inside, the place was exactly what you would expect from a wealthy man who valued order over comfort. The main room served as both office and living space, with a massive desk positioned to face the window overlooking the ocean. Filing cabinets lined one wall, and bookshelves covered another. The furniture was expensive but practical, built to last through whatever weather the Atlantic could deliver. Everything was neat and precisely arranged, which matched what I had learned about Blackwood's personality. He had been a man who believed that success in business required discipline in personal habits. I started with the desk, going through drawers and examining papers. Most of it was shipping company correspondence, contracts and schedules, and letters from clients. But there was also a personal journal, leather-bound and filled with Blackwood's small, careful handwriting. The entries were mostly observations about weather patterns, ship movements visible from the lighthouse, and occasional philosophical musings about solitude and human nature. Nothing jumped out as suspicious, but I photographed the relevant pages because Wolfe had a talent for finding significance in things that looked ordinary to lesser minds. The lighthouse keeper's log was more interesting. Blackwood had maintained it religiously, recording daily weather conditions, visibility, and notes about maritime traffic. The entries went back 5 years and showed remarkable consistency. Every morning at dawn and every evening at dusk, Blackwood had climbed the lighthouse tower and recorded what he observed. The last entry was dated the day before he disappeared, and it was identical in format to all the others. Wind from the northeast, visibility good, 3 cargo ships and 1 fishing vessel visible at various distances. Nothing unusual, nothing that suggested Blackwood had been worried or expecting trouble. The kitchen was where things got interesting. It was larger than I expected, with commercial-grade appliances and enough counter space to handle serious cooking. But it was the wine cellar that justified Wolfe's interest in the case. Accessed through a door in the kitchen floor, it was a climate-controlled room carved into the bedrock beneath the house. The collection was impressive even to my untrained eye, with bottles arranged by region and vintage, each one labeled and catalogued with scientific precision. I took extensive photographs and made notes about the rare spices and aged cheeses that filled custom-built storage areas. If this collection ended up at auction, it would bring enough money to finance a small revolution. I was examining a wheel of cheese that looked older than most Supreme Court justices when I heard the sound of a boat engine approaching the dock. Through the kitchen window, I could see a sleek white launch tying up next to Duggan's boat. 3 people climbed out and started walking toward the house with the purposeful stride of people who had business to conduct. I recognized Robert Blackwood from the photographs in the file, tall and well-dressed with the kind of restless energy that suggested he considered time money and didn't like giving discounts. The woman with him was brunette and poised, moving with the calculated grace of someone who knew exactly how she occupied space. That would be Lila Trent, the crisis management specialist. The third person was a man in an expensive overcoat who carried himself like he owned whatever he was looking at. Marcus Hellman, the development consortium representative, had arrived to inspect his future investment. I closed the cellar door and moved to the front window to watch them approach. Robert was gesturing at the Lighthouse tower and talking rapidly while Hellman nodded and made notes in a leather portfolio. Lila Trent was taking photographs with a professional-grade camera, documenting the property with the thoroughness of someone who understood that details mattered in negotiations. They reached the front door, and Robert produced a key, which meant the heir had come prepared to show off the merchandise. I had about 30 seconds to decide whether to announce my presence or let them discover me. And I chose the direct approach because eavesdropping works better when people don't know you're there. I opened the door before Robert could use his key and gave them my best surprised but friendly smile. Robert's expression suggested he had been expecting to find the place empty and wasn't pleased with the change in plans. I introduced myself as a representative of the estate's legal counsel, which was technically accurate, and explained that I was conducting an inventory of the property's contents. Robert's jaw tightened, but Lila Trent stepped forward with a professional smile and said they were delighted to meet me. She had the kind of voice that could make a tax audit sound like a social invitation, and I made a mental note to be careful around her. Hellman simply looked annoyed, as if my presence was an inconvenience he hadn't budgeted for in his schedule. Robert demanded to know why an inventory was necessary when the property was scheduled for demolition anyway. I told him that the estate had certain legal obligations regarding valuable items, and that someone needed to document what was here before anything was disturbed. Hellman muttered something about delays and lawyers, but Lila Trent smoothly suggested that we could all work together efficiently. She said they were simply conducting their own assessment of the property and would be happy to coordinate with my efforts. I agreed to that arrangement because it would give me a chance to watch them work and see what they were really looking for. For the next hour, I followed them through the house, taking notes and photographs while they measured rooms and discussed renovation possibilities. Robert was clearly eager to get the sale completed and kept pushing Hellman for assurances about the timeline. Hellman was more interested in the structural details, paying particular attention to the foundation and the condition of the Lighthouse tower itself. But it was Lila Trent who surprised me. While the men focused on square footage and construction costs, she was studying the personal touches that revealed how Harrison Blackwood had lived. She examined his books, his papers, and his daily routines with the intensity of someone trying to understand the man as well as the property. When we reached the wine cellar, Hellman's attitude changed noticeably. He spent a long time examining the collection and asking detailed questions about the storage conditions and the cataloging system. Robert seemed impatient with his attention to what he called old bottles and moldy cheese, but Hellman was clearly impressed by the quality and value of what Blackwood had assembled. I made a note of his interest because, in my experience, when developers start caring about wine collections, there's usually more money involved than anyone has mentioned publicly. By the time Duggan returned with his launch, I'd filled 2 notebooks with observations and shot 3 rolls of film. The visitors left first, with Robert promising to call his lawyer about coordinating future access to the property. As their boat disappeared toward the mainland, I stood on the lighthouse gallery and looked out at the gray expanse of ocean that had supposedly claimed Harrison Blackwood. The view was spectacular, but it was also treacherous. The rocks below were sharp and unforgiving, and the tide was strong enough to carry away anything that fell into the water. But I found myself thinking about Mrs. Doyle's words in the anonymous letter. The lighthouse saw everything. From this height, you could observe any boat approaching the island long before it reached the dock. If someone had come here to harm Blackwood, he would have seen them coming. That meant either he knew his attacker or he had been taken completely by surprise. Neither possibility made his death seem accidental. On the boat ride back to Portland, Dugan asked what I thought of the place. I told him it seemed like a lonely way to live, even for someone who valued privacy. He nodded and said that Blackwood had been a solitary man, but not an unhappy one. He had chosen that isolation deliberately, and he had seemed comfortable with it. But Dugan also mentioned something that hadn't been in any of the official reports. In the weeks before Blackwood disappeared, there had been more boat traffic around the island than usual. Nothing dramatic, just occasional visitors who hadn't bothered to stop at the harbor office or register their presence. Dugan had assumed it was people curious about the famous hermit, but now he wondered if there had been more to it than simple curiosity. That evening, from my hotel room overlooking Portland's harbor, I called Wolfe to report my findings. He listened without interruption as I described the lighthouse, the wine collection, and the visit from Robert Blackwood and his associates. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said that the nephew's eagerness to demolish the lighthouse was interesting, as was the developer's sudden interest in the wine cellar. He told me to interview Emile Caro and Mrs. Doyle the next day, and to pay particular attention to any changes in Blackwood's routine or mood in the weeks before his disappearance. He also wanted me to find out more about the boat traffic that Captain Duggan had mentioned. Someone had been visiting the lighthouse, and Wolfe suspected that whoever it was had left more than footprints behind. By 9 the next morning, I was standing in the lobby of a brick office building near the waterfront, looking at a brass directory that put Blackwood Shipping on the 3rd floor between a marine insurance agency and a law firm that specialized in maritime disputes. The receptionist, an efficient woman with steel-rimmed glasses, directed me to a corner office where Emile Caro was waiting with the patient expression of a man who had answered these questions before but was willing to do it again. Caro was in his 50s, compact and graying, with the cautious demeanor of someone who had spent 15 years making sure other people's expensive cargo arrived where it was supposed to. His office was neat but lived in, with shipping schedules pinned to a cork board and nautical charts covering one wall. He listened while I explained that I was investigating Harrison Blackwood's disappearance on behalf of the estate's legal counsel, then settled back in his chair with the air of a man preparing to be thorough. He described their daily routine with the precision of a railroad conductor. Every weekday at 8:30 sharp, Harrison would radio in from the lighthouse for a status report that covered overnight developments, weather delays, and any course corrections needed for the company's fleet. The conversation lasted exactly 20 minutes, and in 15 years, Blackwood had never missed a call without prior notice. That morning, 3 weeks ago, there had been nothing but static. After several attempts, Caro had contacted the Coast Guard, who took over from there. I asked if Blackwood had seemed different in the weeks before he vanished. Caro considered the question carefully, polishing his glasses while he thought. Harrison had always been intense about business, he said, but lately there had been something else occupying his attention. He had been distracted during their calls, asking Caro to repeat information he would normally have absorbed instantly. There had also been longer silences, moments when Blackwood seemed to be listening to something else entirely. What made this particularly interesting was a request Blackwood had made about 2 weeks before his disappearance. He had asked Caro to research the ownership history of several small shipping companies that operated coastal routes in their territory. He wanted to know who owned them, how long they had been in business, and whether there had been any recent changes in management. Caro had compiled the information and transmitted it to the Lighthouse, but Blackwood had never explained why he needed it. When I asked if Caro still had copies of that research, he produced a file from his cabinet without hesitation. The contents were revealing. 5 small shipping operations, all legitimate businesses with clean records, but 3 of them had been purchased within the past year by shell corporations. Those shell corporations traced back to the same parent company, which was owned by Marcus Hellman's development consortiums. I asked if Blackwood had commented on this connection, and Caro said that Harrison had called him the day after receiving the file with a single question. Had Caro noticed any unusual coordination between these newly acquired companies and their shipping schedules? Caro had checked and confirmed that the companies were indeed coordinating their routes in ways that seemed designed to maximize coverage of certain coastal areas. There was also the matter of money. Caro had noticed unusual financial activity in the weeks before Blackwood disappeared. Small amounts had been transferred from Harrison's personal accounts to destinations that Caro couldn't trace, hidden behind banking privacy laws and corporate shells. When I asked about Robert Blackwood's relationship with his uncle, Caro's expression hardened slightly. Robert had visited the Lighthouse twice in the months before Harrison disappeared, which was unusual since the 2 men had never been close. After Robert's second visit, Harrison had called Caro and asked about the legal procedures for changing a will. Mrs. Agnes Doyle lived in a small house on a side street that sloped toward the harbor, with a front garden that showed the kind of attention that comes from having strong opinions about how things should be done. She opened the door before I could knock twice, studying me with sharp eyes while wiping her hands on a dish towel. She was in her 60s, sturdy and practical, with the no-nonsense manner of someone who had spent a lifetime observing human behavior and finding most of it predictable. Once I mentioned Harrison and explained my purpose, she invited me into a kitchen that smelled of fresh bread and strong tea. Within minutes, I was equipped with a mug that could have stripped paint and 2 cookies that would have passed any reasonable test of hospitality. She had worked for Harrison twice a week for 5 years, taking the boat out to clean, cook, and make sure he remembered to eat something besides aged cheese and vintage wine. Harrison had been a good employer, she said, if not what most people would call easy. He liked things done precisely and never accepted shortcuts. But he had been fair and generous, and had never raised his voice to her. In the last month before he disappeared, though, she had noticed changes that worried her. He had started locking doors that had never been locked before. The wine cellar had always been secured, but now he was also locking his office and even his bedroom when he left the house. When she asked about it, he had said something vague about being more careful with valuable items. More telling was his behavior during her final visit, 2 days before he vanished. She had found him in his office studying a nautical chart with intense concentration. When she knocked to announce her arrival, he had quickly rolled up the chart and locked it in his desk drawer, but not before she had glimpsed red circles drawn around several points along the coast, connected by lines that formed a deliberate pattern. I asked if she had mentioned this to the Coast Guard. She said she had tried, but the young officer who interviewed her had seemed more interested in completing his paperwork than listening to observations from a housekeeper. He had noted that she last saw Blackwood 2 days before the disappearance and that everything seemed normal. When she tried to explain about the locked doors and the chart, he had thanked her politely and moved on. Before I left, I asked her directly if she believed Harrison had fallen accidentally from the rocks. She looked at me with those sharp eyes and said that Harrison had walked those rocks in all kinds of weather for 5 years without incident. He knew every inch of that island and was as sure-footed as anyone she had ever seen. The idea that he had suddenly become careless struck her as absurd. When I asked what she thought had really happened, she said she didn't know for certain, but she was convinced someone had come to the island that night, and that Harrison had been expecting them. That evening I called Wolfe from my hotel room and reported what I had learned. He listened with occasional grunts that meant he was filing information in whatever elaborate system he used to organize facts. When I finished, he said the pattern was becoming clearer. Blackwood had discovered something about Hellman's shipping operations, something significant enough to make him change security habits and consider altering his will. The question was whether Blackwood had confronted anyone with his knowledge or had kept it to himself while gathering more evidence. Wolfe instructed me to return to New York immediately and to bring Caro's research file. He also told me to have Saul Panzer investigate the shell corporations that owned the shipping companies. We needed to understand exactly what Hellman's consortium was doing with those coastal routes and whether their coordination served any purpose beyond legitimate business. Wolfe said he was going to arrange for several people to visit the brownstone for what he called a clarifying conversation. When I asked who he planned to invite, he said that sometimes the most effective way to catch fish was to create disturbance in the water and observe what swam toward the bait. The flight back to New York gave me time to consider what I had learned. Harrison Blackwood had been a methodical man who had stumbled onto something that made him nervous enough to lock doors and study charts in secret. He had been researching shipping companies that belonged to the same consortium now eager to purchase his property, and he had been planning changes that would affect his nephew's inheritance. The pieces suggested a man who had discovered a secret worth protecting and possibly worth killing for. The only remaining question was whether he had died because of what he knew or because of what he planned to do about it. I got back to the brownstone just after 4 on Friday afternoon, tired enough to appreciate the sight of Fritz in the hallway with that expression of relief he wore when all members of the household were accounted for and dinner was still possible. I dropped my suitcase and headed for the office, where I found Wolfe behind his desk with a glass of beer and Saul Panzer in the red leather chair with a briefcase full of documents spread across the small table beside him. Saul nodded at me with that mild expression he wore when he had been busy dismantling someone's carefully constructed lies. Wolfe gestured for me to sit and asked me to summarize my main findings for Saul's benefit. I went through the interviews with Caro and Mrs. Doyle, emphasizing the locked doors, the mysterious nautical chart, and Blackwood's sudden interest in researching shipping companies. When I finished, Wolfe turned to Saul with raised eyebrows. Saul opened his briefcase with the methodical movements of a surgeon selecting instruments and began his report. The shell corporations that owned the coastal shipping companies were more interesting than they had initially appeared. Each company had been purchased within weeks of Hellman's consortium acquiring coastal properties in the same regions. When Saul mapped the shipping routes and the real estate holdings, the pattern became unmistakable. The consortium was creating a network that could monitor maritime traffic along specific stretches of coastline with unusual thoroughness. More significantly, several of the shipping companies had made rote modifications in the past 6 months that served no apparent commercial purpose. They were burning extra fuel and time to coordinate their movements in ways that suggested careful choreography. Wolfe asked what legitimate business purpose this coordination might serve. Saul said that, on the surface, it looked like an attempt to dominate coastal shipping through route control and infrastructure ownership, but the level of precision suggested something more targeted. The network could track vessel movements and create opportunities for activities that required coordination away from official scrutiny. When I asked what kind of activities, Saul said his investigation had uncovered payments from the consortium to a private security firm whose services were described only as maritime consultation. What made this particularly interesting was the warehouse facility that Hellman's consortium had acquired in a small port town 20 miles south of Blackwood's Lighthouse. The facility was officially listed as storage for construction materials, but the equipment installations told a different story. High-end refrigeration units, specialized climate control systems, and security measures that seemed excessive for storing lumber and concrete. Saul had also found records showing that the warehouse received deliveries from the coordinated shipping routes on a regular schedule that had nothing to do with construction needs. Wolfe leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. After a long moment, he said that Harrison Blackwood had been a shipping expert positioned at the one vantage point where this coordination would have been visible. From his lighthouse, he could observe vessels altering course, meeting at specific coordinates, or transferring cargo in ways that would be invisible from any other location. Once his suspicion was aroused, his research into the company ownership would have revealed the common control and the broader implications. The question, Wolfe continued, was what Blackwood had planned to do with his knowledge. Mrs. Doyle had mentioned that he was considering changes to his will, and Caro had confirmed unusual financial activity in his personal accounts. Either Blackwood was preparing to expose the operation, or he was positioning himself to profit from his silence. Either possibility made him dangerous to people who had invested considerable resources in maintaining secrecy. I asked whether we had enough evidence to involve law enforcement. Wolfe said that suspicion was not evidence, and patterns were not proof. What we needed was confirmation of what Blackwood had discovered and identification of who had acted on the knowledge that he possessed it. He instructed me to call Victoria Marsh and arrange for certain individuals to visit the brownstone tomorrow afternoon. He wanted Robert Blackwood, Lila Trent, Marcus Hellman, and Emile Caro present for what he termed a clarifying discussion. When I asked what he planned to accomplish with this gathering, Wolfe said that lies required maintenance and coordination, especially when multiple people were involved in concealing the truth. By introducing information they didn't know had been discovered, he would create pressure that would reveal inconsistencies and forced decisions. Someone in that room knew what had happened to Harrison Blackwood, and someone had sent the anonymous letter that started our investigation. Those might or might not be the same person, but the confrontation would produce clarity either way. After Saul left with instructions to continue investigating the consortium's financial structure, I spent an hour on the phone making arrangements. Victoria Marsh was skeptical about gathering everyone together, but agreed when I explained that new evidence required immediate discussion. Robert Blackwood objected until Marsh mentioned his legal obligations under probate law. Hellman was diplomatically reluctant, citing schedule conflicts that Marsh efficiently demolished. Lila Trent accepted immediately with professional smoothness that made me wonder what she was really thinking. Caro agreed without hesitation, saying he wanted to understand what had happened to Harrison as much as anyone. That evening over dinner, Fritz served lamb with rosemary that would have justified several minor felonies, and Wolfe was in the expansive mood that meant he was pleased with how events were developing. When I asked what he expected from tomorrow's confrontation, he said that guilty parties typically revealed themselves through their reactions to pressure rather than through direct confession. Someone would make a mistake, contradict themselves, or display knowledge they shouldn't possess. The anonymous letter had been sent by someone who wanted the truth exposed, and tomorrow's gathering would provide them with an opportunity to elaborate on their concerns in a more direct fashion. I pointed out that we still had no physical evidence and no body to prove murder had occurred. Wolfe said that bodies were overrated as evidence since they usually only confirmed what intelligent analysis could establish through other means. What mattered was motive, opportunity, and the pattern of behavior that revealed guilt. Harrison Blackwood had discovered something that threatened a profitable operation. He had been preparing to take action that would have exposed it, and multiple people had reasons to want him silenced. Tomorrow would determine which of those people had acted on their motivation and whether the Lighthouse had indeed seen everything as the anonymous letter claimed. Saturday afternoon arrived with the kind of November chill that made the warmth of the brownstone feel like a small victory against the world's indifference. Fritz had arranged the office with his usual precision, positioning extra chairs in a semicircle facing Wolfe's desk and ensuring the coffee service was ready for what promised to be a lengthy and potentially volatile gathering. I took my position at my desk with a fresh notebook, though I suspected the real drama would be in watching faces rather than recording words. The guests arrived in a careful sequence that suggested coordination, or at least mutual awareness of timing. Victoria Marsh came first, carrying her briefcase with the determined air of someone prepared for legal complications. Emile Caro followed, looking uncomfortable in his best suit, but resolute in a way that suggested he had made decisions about where his loyalties lay. Robert Blackwood and Lila Trent arrived together, bringing an atmosphere of expensive cologne and barely contained impatience. Robert checked his watch twice before sitting down, while Lila surveyed the office with the calculating gaze of someone who evaluated every environment for strategic advantage. Marcus Hellman was last, striding in with the confident bearing of a man who assumed any meeting he attended was convened for his benefit. He declined Fritz's offer of coffee and positioned himself in the center chair with the territorial instincts of someone accustomed to commanding attention. Once everyone was seated and Fritz had withdrawn, Wolfe closed the book he had been reading with deliberate ceremony and surveyed his assembled guests with the patient attention of a naturalist observing specimens. Wolfe began by thanking them for their attendance and explaining that his investigation into Harrison Blackwood's disappearance had uncovered information that required clarification. He said this with the kind of measured formality that suggested he was being polite rather than grateful, and that the clarification would proceed whether they cooperated or not. Victoria Marsh had engaged his services to evaluate the credibility of certain claims, and that evaluation had revealed patterns that demanded explanation. Robert Blackwood immediately objected that the Coast Guard had concluded their investigation and ruled the death accidental. Any attempt to prolong the matter was simply delaying the estate settlement and creating unnecessary complications for everyone involved. Wolfe regarded him with the expression he reserved for people who confused volume with validity. He observed that conclusions of convenience were not the same as determinations of fact, and that accidental death was often the preferred explanation when evidence was insufficient rather than when evidence was conclusive. Wolfe then turned to Emile Caro and asked him to describe for everyone present the research that Harrison Blackwood had requested in the weeks before his disappearance. Caro glanced nervously at Hellman before speaking, which told me he understood the significance of what he was about to reveal. He explained Blackwood's request for ownership information on coastal shipping companies and the subsequent discovery that several had been acquired by shell corporations connected to Hellman's consortium. When Caro mentioned the coordinated shipping routes and their unusual patterns, I watched Hellman's expression tighten almost imperceptibly. Hellman responded with smooth professionalism that his consortium's shipping investments were entirely legitimate business operations designed to improve efficiency through coordinated scheduling. There was nothing unusual about companies under common ownership working together to optimize their routes and reduce operational costs. Wolfe nodded agreeably and said that coordination itself was indeed unremarkable. What was interesting, he continued, was the specific pattern of that coordination and its relationship to other consortium properties along the same coastline. At this point, Wolfe gestured for me to display the map that Saul Panzer had prepared, showing the shipping routes, the consortium's real estate holdings, and the warehouse facility with its specialized equipment. The pattern was clear even to casual observation. The coordinated vessels were creating a network that could monitor and control maritime traffic along specific coastal stretches in ways that served no obvious commercial purpose. When I mentioned the climate-controlled warehouse and its regular deliveries from the coordinated ships, Hellman's carefully maintained composure showed its first crack. Lila Trent spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the kind of professional neutrality that crisis management specialists use when diffusing volatile situations. She pointed out that even if the consortium's operations seemed unusual to outside observers that didn't establish any connection to Harrison Blackwood's unfortunate death, business logistics could appear suspicious to those unfamiliar with modern supply chain management. Wolfe inclined his head politely and agreed that she was correct about the distinction between suspicion and evidence. What established the connection, Wolfe continued, was Harrison Blackwood's unique position and expertise. From his lighthouse vantage point, he could observe maritime traffic patterns that would be invisible from any other location. His 15 years of experience in shipping logistics would have made him capable of recognizing coordination that served purposes beyond legitimate commerce. And his sudden interest in researching the companies involved indicated that he had indeed recognized something significant. Wolfe then addressed the behavioral changes that Mrs. Doyle and Emile Caro had observed in Blackwood's final weeks. The locked doors, the secretive study of nautical charts, the unusual financial transfers, and the inquiries about changing his will all pointed to a man who had discovered something important and was preparing for either confrontation or negotiation. These were not the actions of someone planning an evening walk that would end in accidental death. Robert Blackwood demanded to know what Wolfe was implying about his uncle's state of mind. Wolfe said he was not implying anything about Harrison's mental state, which had apparently been excellent. He was stating facts about Harrison's actions, which suggested a man taking precautions against people who might not want his discoveries made public. The question was whether those precautions had been sufficient. Emile Caro cleared his throat and said there was something he hadn't mentioned to the Coast Guard because he hadn't understood its significance at the time. 3 days before Harrison disappeared, he had received a brief radio transmission asking Caro to witness a new will if Harrison brought one to the office. Harrison had said he was making changes that would ensure certain information reached appropriate authorities if anything happened to him. Caro had agreed, but Harrison never brought the document and never mentioned it again. The silence that followed this revelation was profound. Robert's face had gone pale, and he was staring at Caro with an expression that mixed shock with something that might have been fear. Hellman was studying his hand with the intense concentration of someone performing rapid mental calculations. Victoria Marsh made careful notes while maintaining her professional composure, but I could see the legal implications registering in her expression. Wolfe allowed the silence to extend until it became uncomfortable, then observed that Harrison Blackwood had been a methodical man who documented his observations and secured his evidence. If he had discovered activities that warranted federal investigation, he would have created records. If he had been preparing to expose those activities, he would have taken precautions to ensure the information survived, even if he did not. I chose that moment to mention Captain Dugan's observations about increased boat traffic around the lighthouse in the weeks before Blackwood vanished. Several vessels had approached the island without registering at the harbor office, which was unusual for that carefully monitored area. Dugan had initially assumed they were curious tourists, but the timing and frequency suggested more purposeful visits. Hellman acknowledged that he had visited the lighthouse twice in the month before Blackwood's disappearance, both times on legitimate business regarding the potential property purchase. He had been transparent about his consortium's interest in acquiring the lighthouse for development, and Blackwood had been receptive to discussing terms. There was nothing sinister about those visits, he insisted, though his voice carried less conviction than his words. Wolfe asked whether Hellman had been alone during these visits. After a brief hesitation, Hellman admitted that he had brought associates on one occasion to assess the property's development potential. When Wolfe pressed for the identities of these associates, Hellman said they were technical consultants whose names he would need to check his records to recall accurately. It was the kind of evasion that fooled nobody and convinced everyone that the names would be worth investigating. Robert Blackwood suddenly stood up, his face flushed with anger or panic. He declared the entire proceeding ridiculous and possibly actionable. His uncle had died in an accident. and any suggestion otherwise was defamatory speculation designed to delay the estate settlement. He was leaving immediately and would instruct his attorney to file complaints about this harassment of grieving family members. Wolfe's voice stopped Robert before he could reach the door. He suggested that Robert might want to hear about the anonymous letter before making legal threats that could prove embarrassing. The letter had claimed that Harrison Blackwood was murdered and that the Lighthouse saw everything. The writer had urged asking the right questions or the truth would die with the tide. Someone in this room understood what those questions were, and someone knew what answers the Lighthouse could provide. Wolfe's gaze moved slowly around the room, resting briefly on each face before settling on Emil Caro. He observed that the anonymous letter contained details that only someone intimate with Blackwood's habits and circumstances would know. The reference to the Lighthouse seeing everything was a phrase Harrison used frequently. The mention of the tide was specific to the location and timing, and the method of delivery suggested someone who wanted to prompt an investigation without revealing their identity or endangering their safety. Caro looked down at his hands, his shoulders sagging with the weight of a decision he had been avoiding. When he looked up again, his face was pale but determined. He admitted that he had written and sent the anonymous letter. He explained that he had suspected foul play from the beginning but had no proof that would convince skeptical authorities. He knew Harrison had been investigating the consortium and had been increasingly worried about what he was discovering. When Harrison disappeared and the Coast Guard accepted the accident theory so quickly, Caro had felt helpless and frustrated. He knew the estate lawyers would hire a private investigator if there was a credible threat to the probate process, so he had written the letter to force a proper inquiry. He hadn't come forward openly because he feared for his own safety if he accused powerful people of murder without sufficient evidence to protect himself. The admission hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Hellman was staring at Caro with undisguised hostility, while Robert looked stunned by this revelation from someone he had trusted to handle his uncle's business affairs. Lila Trent remained professionally composed, but her eyes were moving between the faces in the room with the calculating attention of someone reassessing odds and possibilities. Wolfe thanked Caro for his honesty and observed that his action, while risky, had been effective in achieving its intended purpose. They were now at the point where the truth about Harrison Blackwood's fate could be established with reasonable certainty. The question that remained was identifying who had been on the island the night Blackwood died, someone who could approach without raising alarm and who knew enough about the property to move through it efficiently in darkness. The gathering had reached the crucial moment where accusations would become specific and denials would become desperate. Wolfe's patient questioning had established the framework of conspiracy and motive. Now came the delicate work of identifying which of the people in this room had moved from planning to action, and whether that person was prepared to confess or would force him to demonstrate their guilt through the weight of accumulated evidence. The pause that followed Caro's admission stretched until the air itself seemed to thicken with unspoken accusations. Wolfe let the silence work on his assembled guests before speaking with the measured precision of a surgeon making the first incision. He observed that anonymous letters were typically written by people who possessed dangerous knowledge but lacked the courage or evidence to act openly. Mr. Tsar, Caro's admission confirmed what the letter itself had suggested. Someone with intimate knowledge of Harrison Blackwood's habits and circumstances had suspected murder from the beginning. Wolfe turned his attention to Robert Blackwood, whose earlier bluster had evaporated into nervous silence. He asked Robert directly about his financial situation, noting that inherited wealth often motivated desperate actions when current circumstances were sufficiently dire. Robert glanced at Lila Trent as if seeking permission before admitting that his marketing consultancy had lost several key clients and that he had accumulated debts his current income couldn't service. The inheritance represented his only viable path back to solvency, which explained his eagerness to complete the property sale despite the anonymous letter's implications. What made this particularly interesting Wolfe continued, was the timeline of Robert's negotiations with the consortium. Robert reluctantly confirmed that discussions had been ongoing for months before Harrison's death, with provisional agreements contingent upon his inheritance. This contradicted the impression that Robert had only engaged with developers after becoming heir, and it suggested planning that preceded any accidental death by considerable time. Wolfe then shifted his focus to Lila Trent, complimenting her professional acumen while noting that crisis management specialists were valuable precisely because they understood information flow and coordination during sensitive situations. Her engagement to Robert created an obvious connection between the heir and the consortium, but her professional relationship suggested deeper involvement than mere romantic attachment. I chose this moment to present the phone records that Saul had obtained through his usual methods. The documentation showed a series of calls between Robert's phone and Lila's firm in the weeks before Harrison disappeared, along with a substantial payment from one of the consortium's shell corporations to Lila's company for unspecified consulting services. The timing was unmistakable. Someone had been coordinating responses to Harrison's investigation well before his death. Lila's professional composure flickered as she acknowledged the calls, but insisted they concerned routine business matters unrelated to Harrison or the Lighthouse. Wolfe observed mildly that the payment amount seemed excessive for routine consultation, particularly when it coincided so precisely with Harrison's research into the consortium's shipping operations. Hellman, who had been growing increasingly agitated, demanded to know what Wolfe was implying about legitimate business operations. Wolfe replied that legitimacy was precisely what was in question. He gestured for me to display the map Saul had prepared, showing the consortium's coordinated shipping routes and their relationship to coastal properties. The pattern created a network capable of monitoring and controlling maritime traffic in ways that served no obvious commercial purpose. From his Lighthouse vantage point, Wolfe explained, Harrison Blackwood could observe vessel movements that would be invisible from any other location. His expertise in shipping logistics made him uniquely capable of recognizing coordination that served purposes beyond legitimate commerce. When his suspicions were aroused, his research into company ownership would have revealed the common control and broader implications. Emile Caro suddenly straightened in his chair, animated by a memory he had just connected to current revelations. He said that Harrison had mentioned discovering the pattern in their final conversation and had asked about legal procedures for changing his will. Harrison had also requested information about witness requirements for new testamentary documents, suggesting he was preparing protections that would survive his death. Wolfe nodded approvingly and said this confirmed Harrison's methodical nature. A man who documented shipping schedules religiously would certainly document evidence of illegal activities with equal precision. The question was where such documentation might be hidden, particularly if Harrison suspected he was in danger. At this point, Wolfe made an observation that seemed to emerge from nowhere but carried the weight of careful preparation. He noted that I had photographed the Lighthouse kitchen extensively, including detailed shots of Harrison's prized spice collection. One photograph showed a jar of pre-war Spanish saffron in its usual position on the shelf. A later photograph, taken after our visitors had inspected the property, showed the same jar sitting on the counter with its lid slightly askew. Mrs. Doyle confirmed that she had left the kitchen spotless during her final visit, with everything in its proper place. I verified that the jar had been undisturbed when I arrived and first photographed the room. That left only the 3 visitors who had inspected the property with me, Robert, Hellman, and Lila. Robert and Hellman denied touching anything in the kitchen. Lila hesitated before admitting she might have examined the spice collection out of curiosity about the inventory's value. Wolfe asked why a crisis management specialist would be particularly interested in saffron, and before she could answer, he answered for her. She wasn't interested in the saffron itself, but in what Harrison Blackwood had hidden inside the jar. I opened the evidence bag I had prepared, containing the saffron jar I had retrieved from the lighthouse, following Wolfe's specific instructions. I unscrewed the lid and poured the contents onto a white sheet on Wolfe's desk. Among the dark red threads of saffron was a small, tightly rolled cylinder of microfilm. The reaction was immediate and revealing. Hellman half rose from his chair before sinking back under Wolfe's steady gaze. Robert looked genuinely baffled, his surprise apparently authentic. But Lila Trent went very still, her professional mask slipping to reveal something colder and more calculating beneath. Wolfe explained that Harrison had chosen his concealment with characteristic intelligence. He knew that casual searchers would overlook a spice jar, but he also knew that if something happened to him, his valuable collection would be examined by experts who would appreciate its contents. It was a message designed to reach someone with the knowledge and motivation to act on the evidence. The microfilm contained detailed logs of shipping manifests, course deviations, and photographs taken through Harrison's telescope. The images showed cargo transfers at sea between consortium vessels and unidentified boats, with dates, coordinates, and times meticulously recorded. Most damaging were photographs showing Marcus Hellman personally supervising these transfers, directly linking him to what was clearly an illegal smuggling operation. Hellman's face had gone gray as the implications became clear. The consortium's coastal properties weren't being developed for legitimate purposes. They were creating a distribution network for contraband operations. Harrison's lighthouse had provided the perfect surveillance position to document their activities, but the microfilm revealed more than Hellman's criminal enterprise. The final images showed meetings between Hellman and a woman whose face was clearly visible in Harrison's telephoto shots. It was Lila Trent, photographed in contexts that had nothing to do with crisis management or her engagement to Robert. Wolfe turned to Lila with the patient attention of someone who had been building toward this moment throughout the entire confrontation. He observed that her role extended far beyond professional consultation or romantic attachment. She had cultivated Robert's financial dependence, encouraged his debts, and positioned him to inherit the lighthouse so the consortium could acquire the property and eliminate the surveillance threat. When Harrison discovered her deception and began documenting the evidence, she had taken direct action to protect the operation. The night Harrison died, Wolfe continued, Lila had gone to the lighthouse not to negotiate, but to search for evidence she knew existed. Her familiarity with the property through Robert gave her the knowledge needed to approach without raising immediate alarm. When she couldn't locate the documentation, and Harrison confronted her about her true purpose, the situation had escalated beyond her control. Lila stood slowly, her composure finally shattered completely. She looked at Robert with contempt, at Hellman with fury, and at Wolfe with a mixture of hatred and grudging respect. She didn't confess, but her silence and the way she calculated the distance to the door said everything necessary. I moved to block the exit as Saul Panzer emerged from the front room where he had been waiting with Inspector Kramer of the NYPD. Kramer entered with the satisfied expression of a man who finally had solid evidence after days of vague reports and theoretical conspiracies. He had heard enough through the connecting door to justify taking everyone downtown for formal statements and charges. As the officers escorted Lila, Hellman and a bewildered Robert from the brownstone, Emile Caro remained in his chair, staring at the scattered saffron and microfilm. He asked quietly whether Harrison had suffered. Wolfe replied that Harrison Blackwood had died defending his principles and his home, which was as honorable a death as any man could achieve. He had outsmarted his enemies even from the grave, using his intelligence and his passions to ensure justice prevailed. After the police had cleared the office and the front door had closed on the commotion, the room returned to its familiar stillness. Wolfe sat back in his chair and closed his eyes, the ordeal of extended social interaction having taken its customary toll. I carefully gathered the precious saffron, returning it to its jar with the respect due to ingredients that had helped solve a murder. Wolfe opened his eyes and regarded me with the expression of a man ready to return to life's more reliable pleasures. He observed that it was dinner time, and that Fritz was preparing something that would restore faith in human civilization after an afternoon spent contemplating its failures. I agreed, noting that while justice was satisfying, it was rarely as delicious as Fritz's cooking, and considerably less predictable in its outcomes. The silence that settled over the office after our guests departed was profound, carrying the weight of revelations and the relief of justice served. Victoria Marsh remained in the red leather chair, her briefcase closed but her hands still folded with the careful precision of someone processing legal implications. Emile Caro sat slumped in the yellow chair, looking like a man who had carried a heavy burden for weeks and was only now realizing his shoulders were free. The air still held traces of expensive perfume and nervous perspiration, but underneath it was the familiar comfort of old leather, books, and the lingering aroma of precious saffron. Wolfe surveyed the restored order of his domain with satisfaction before rising from his chair with the deliberate movements of a man who had completed his intellectual labors and was ready for more reliable pleasures. He announced that Fritz was preparing pheasant with chestnut stuffing and that dinner would proceed at the usual time. Victoria Marsh declined the invitation with professional courtesy, citing the extensive legal work that awaited her. Caro also begged off, saying he needed to return to his hotel and prepare for an early flight back to Maine. After they departed with appropriate thanks and promises to forward additional documentation, Wolfe and I proceeded to the dining room where the civilization's more dependable satisfactions awaited our attention. The pheasant was everything Fritz's reputation promised, and Wolfe applied himself with the concentration that marked his approach to all worthy endeavors. We maintained the comfortable silence that good food deserved until the main course was cleared and Fritz had served his masterpiece of a dessert. Only then did Wolfe consent to conversation, dabbing his lips with his napkin and regarding me with the expression he wore when preparing to illuminate my intellectual shortcomings. I asked the question that had been nagging at me since the microfilm appeared on his desk. How exactly had he known to focus on that particular saffron jar among all the valuable items in Harrison's collection? Wolfe leaned back in his chair and explained with the patient tone he used for obvious truths. Harrison Blackwood had been a methodical man who valued precision in all things. His journals showed he noticed every deviation in weather patterns and shipping schedules. Such a man would not allow chaos to develop in his private sanctuary. Yet my photographs, taken hours apart, showed one small but undeniable anomaly. The saffron jar displaced from its shelf to the counter, its lid slightly askew after our visitors had completed their inspection. More significantly, Wolfe continued, Harrison had written extensively about that particular saffron in his personal journal, describing it as irreplaceable pre-war Spanish stock of extraordinary quality. A man who would rhapsodize about a spice in his private writings would certainly choose it as the hiding place for evidence of equal value. The microfilm represented Harrison's most precious secret, and he had combined it with his most treasured ingredient in a single vessel that honored both. Before I could argue with this typically Wolfian logic, Fritz appeared with the telephone. Inspector Kramer was calling with updates that couldn't wait for morning, and from Fritz's expression you would have thought someone had suggested serving the pheasant with ketchup. Wolfe sighed and hauled himself to the office with the air of a man whose digestive peace was being unnecessarily disturbed. Kramer's voice carried the satisfaction of a detective whose case had broken wide open. Lila Trent had confessed to Harrison's murder after 6 hours of interrogation, providing details that confirmed our reconstruction of events. She had gone to the Lighthouse that night, intending to search for evidence while Harrison was occupied elsewhere, but he had confronted her in his office with photographs and documentation spread across his desk. He had told her he knew about her manipulation of Robert and her real relationship with the consortium, and that he was taking everything to federal authorities in the morning. According to her statement, Harrison had turned to secure the documents in his safe when she had grabbed a brass nautical instrument from his desk and struck him fatally. She had spent hours searching for his evidence, growing increasingly desperate when she couldn't locate the primary documentation. Finally, she had staged the scene to suggest Harrison had gone for his evening walk, taken his body in his own boat, weighted it with anchor chain, and disposed of it in deep water where currents would prevent recovery. The microfilm in the saffron jar had been Harrison's insurance policy, but Lila's focus on obvious hiding places had caused her to overlook the kitchen entirely. Her return to the lighthouse with Robert and Hellman had been her final desperate attempt to locate documentation before new ownership potentially discovered what she had missed. Kramer also reported that Marcus Hellman faced multiple federal charges related to the smuggling operation, which had been importing controlled substances and evading customs duties on luxury goods. The coordinated shipping routes had created a system for transferring contraband from international vessels to domestic boats in coastal waters, then distributing through warehouse facilities disguised as construction operations. Harrison's documentation provided evidence spanning 2 years of operations across 4 states. The following morning brought Victoria Marsh back to the brownstone, this time with the satisfied expression of someone whose legal complications had resolved themselves more elegantly than anticipated. She carried a leather portfolio and the news that Robert Blackwood, while devastated by revelations about Lila's manipulation, would not face conspiracy charges. The prosecutors had accepted that he had been a pawn rather than a participant, though his inheritance remained tied up in civil litigation as victims of the smuggling operation filed claims against the estate. She also brought more welcome news about the disposition of Harrison's prized collection. The estate trustees had authorized her to honor specific bequests mentioned in Harrison's journal, including several cases of rare wine and the remaining spice collection for the brownstone. She presented a check representing Wolfe's fee plus a substantial bonus that reflected the trustees' gratitude for preventing a lengthy and expensive legal battle. Emil Caro visited that afternoon to tender his resignation from Blackwood Shipping and to thank Wolfe personally for uncovering the truth. He had accepted a position with a maritime insurance firm that valued his expertise and integrity, unable to continue with a company now associated with murder and conspiracy. Before leaving, he asked whether Harrison had known he was in danger that final night. Wolfe replied that Harrison had certainly understood he was threatening powerful interests and had taken precautions accordingly, but had underestimated the desperation of people who had invested heavily in maintaining their secrets. As evening approached and the brownstone settled into its familiar rhythms, I found myself in the office organizing case files while Wolfe read with a glass of beer at his elbow. The saffron jar sat on his desk, properly refilled and sealed, looking innocent and aromatic despite its role as key evidence in a murder case. Fritz was in the kitchen preparing dinner with some of Harrison's bequeathed cheeses, humming with the contentment of a chef given worthy ingredients. When I commented that the case had resolved itself with unusual neatness, Wolfe observed that Harrison Blackwood had been an exceptional man who had used his intelligence to defeat brute force even from beyond the grave. He had combined his passion for quality with his commitment to justice, creating evidence that honored both values. The rare Spanish saffron had been his final message to whoever solved his murder, a gesture of respect between men who understood that civilization's preservation sometimes required attention to details others dismissed as trivial. I pointed out that his concern for the wine collection seemed to burn brighter than his sympathy for the human wreckage left behind. Wolfe snorted and replied that men chose their own follies, whereas a good vintage had no control over who uncorked it or for what occasion. The best service we could perform for humanity was ensuring that whatever elements of civilization it managed to produce were preserved from vandals, whether they wielded bulldozers or balance sheets. Fritz appeared in the doorway to announce that dinner was ready, and the aroma accompanying him suggested the aged cheese had been deployed to magnificent effect. Wolfe rose with the careful deliberation of a man anticipating worthy pleasures, and we proceeded to the dining room where the evening's more reliable satisfactions awaited our attention. The case was closed, justice had been served, and civilization had been preserved for another day. In Wolfe's universe, that represented a satisfactory conclusion to any investigation. 3 weeks after the headlines about the Lighthouse murder had faded from the front pages to the obituary section, the brownstone had settled back into its familiar rhythms of orchids, meals, and the comfortable illusion that the outside world existed primarily as a source of interesting problems and exceptional ingredients. Fritz had been conducting what could only be described as a sustained campaign to discover the full potential of pre-war Spanish saffron, while Wolfe had returned to his books with the satisfaction of a man who had restored proper order to a corner of the universe that had temporarily forgotten its manners. Inspector Kramer arrived on a grey Tuesday afternoon, carrying the resigned expression of someone delivering news he considered both necessary and tedious. He settled into the red leather chair with the deliberate movements of a man who had spent considerable time explaining obvious truths to federal prosecutors who preferred their cases gift-wrapped with constitutional guarantees. When Fritz offered refreshment, Kramer requested beer with the air of someone who felt entitled to small compensations for bureaucratic suffering. The federal case against Marcus Hellman and Lila Trent had developed into what Kramer described as a prosecutor's dream and a defense attorney's nightmare. The microfilm from Harrison's saffron jar had provided not merely evidence, but a complete roadmap of the smuggling operation, including financial records, shipping manifests, and photographs that documented 2 years of systematic criminal activity. Harrison had essentially prepared the entire prosecution case, complete with witness lists and documentary evidence locations. The federal attorneys estimated that the network had moved over $15 million in contraband, with Hellman's consortium collecting substantial fees for providing infrastructure and coordination. Lila Trent had confessed to Harrison's murder after extensive interrogation, providing details that confirmed the reconstruction Wolfe had presented. She had gone to the Lighthouse that final night, intending to search for evidence while Harrison was occupied elsewhere, but he had confronted her in his office with photographs and documentation spread across his desk. When he told her he was taking everything to federal authorities in the morning, desperation had overcome calculation. The brass nautical instrument from his desk had become a weapon of opportunity, and Harrison's methodical nature had become his fatal vulnerability. After Kramer departed with his empty beer glass and his satisfied expression, the afternoon brought an unexpected but welcome visitor. Mrs. Agnes Doyle arrived carrying a covered basket and wearing the determined look of someone who had traveled considerable distance to complete an important mission. She thanked Wolfe for uncovering the truth about Harrison's death, explaining that uncertainty had been worse than grief because it suggested his life had ended meaninglessly. Knowing that he had died defending his principles and that his evidence had brought justice provided the closure that official accident reports never could have delivered. From her basket, she produced Harrison's personal recipe collection, a leather-bound journal accumulated over decades of collecting rare ingredients and experimenting with their preparation. Harrison had mentioned Wolfe's reputation during one of her visits, and she believed he would have wanted his culinary notes to reach someone who would appreciate and use them rather than gathering dust in storage. She also brought several jars of preserves made from berries grown on the Lighthouse Island, representing Harrison's final harvest before his death. Wolfe accepted these gifts with genuine gratitude, something I rarely witnessed in his interactions with the outside world. He leafed through the journal with careful attention, pausing occasionally to read entries that caught his interest. When he looked up at Mrs. Doyle, His expression carried unusual warmth as he observed that Harrison Blackwood had understood that civilization required constant maintenance and that small acts of preserving quality and integrity formed the foundation upon which larger principles rested. The following day brought Fritz's masterpiece. He had spent considerable time consulting Harrison's notes and 3 different cookbooks before settling on a risotto Milanese that would, in his words, justify the entire history of the spice trade. The aroma that drifted from the kitchen was rich and golden, carrying the warmth of Mediterranean sun into the November chill of New York. When we sat down to lunch, the risotto glowed under the dining room chandelier, a mound of creamy rice that seemed to embody the transformation of evidence into sustenance. Wolfe's first bite was taken with the concentrated attention he reserved for significant moments. He chewed slowly, analyzing the interplay of flavors before declaring it acceptable, which in his vocabulary constituted the highest praise. The saffron had lost none of its potency despite its age, possessing what he described as a metallic, honeyed bitterness that modern cultivation could not replicate. It was, he noted, a flavor of distinct integrity, much like the man who had collected it. Over coffee, I asked a question that had been troubling me. Harrison Blackwood had been intelligent, wealthy, and cautious. He knew he was in danger, and who threatened him. Why had he remained on that isolated rock waiting for them to come to him instead of taking his evidence to safety on the mainland until authorities could intervene? Wolfe regarded me with the patient expression he wore when explaining fundamental principles to those who confused tactics with psychology. Harrison Blackwood, he said, was not merely a man who lived in a lighthouse. He had become the lighthouse itself. 15 years of defining his existence through his ability to observe what others missed had made retreat impossible. His mistake was not in staying, but in failing to understand that the most dangerous enemy approaches not across the water, but through the door, invited by trust and armed with desperation. Victoria Marsh's final report arrived the following week, confirming that the lighthouse had been preserved as a maritime research station rather than demolished for development. Robert Blackwood would inherit approximately 1/4 of his uncle's wealth after legal settlements. Enough for comfort, but not excess. Harrison's wine collection had been auctioned, with proceeds supporting maritime safety programs that would honor his memory with practical vigilance rather than empty monuments. That evening, Fritz served a bottle from Harrison's bequeathed collection, a vintage Burgundy that Harrison's notes described as exceptional. As we sat with our glasses, Wolfe raised his in silent tribute to a man he had never met but clearly respected. The lighthouse had indeed seen everything, as the anonymous letter claimed, but it had required human intelligence and integrity to translate those observations into evidence that would survive beyond the observer's death. When I observed that we had been hired to investigate an anonymous letter and ended up solving a murder, dismantling a smuggling operation, and saving a wine collection from developers, Wolfe replied that the wine collection was obviously the most important outcome. Murders and smuggling operations were depressingly common, while pre-war Spanish saffron and vintage Burgundy represented increasingly rare treasures that deserved protection from a world that valued convenience over character. The brownstone settled into evening quiet, with Fritz in the kitchen planning tomorrow's menu and Wolfe absorbed in his book. Outside, November darkness pressed against the windows, but inside there was warmth, order, and the satisfaction of having preserved something worth preserving. Harrison Blackwood's lighthouse continued its silent watch over gray Atlantic waters, and his final message had reached exactly the right audience. In Wolfe's universe, that represented civilization functioning as it should, with intelligence and integrity defeating corruption and chaos through the simple expedient of paying attention to quality in all things, whether saffron or justice. Winter had settled over New York with a kind of determined thoroughness that made the brownstone feel like a fortress against the world's less civilized impulses. 3 weeks had passed since the headlines about Lighthouse murders had faded from the front pages, and Wolfe had returned to his books with the satisfaction of a man who had restored proper order to a corner of the universe that had temporarily forgotten its manners. The check from the Blackwood estate had cleared, adding a comfortable sequence of zeros to our balance that would keep Fritz in truffles and the orchids in fertilizer well into spring. I was at my desk organizing correspondence when the doorbell rang on a gray December afternoon. Through the one-way glass, I saw Robert Blackwood, but this wasn't the nervous, well-dressed air we had confronted weeks earlier. He wore a heavy wool peacoat instead of cashmere, and something in his posture suggested a man who had been walking in actual weather rather than just from limousines to restaurants. When I brought him to the office, he declined the red leather chair and stood near the fire, warming his hands with the deliberate movements of someone who had learned to appreciate simple comforts. He told us he was leaving New York the next morning. The legal proceedings were finally settled, and he had sold what remained of his marketing consultancy after the scandal. His debts were paid, and he was starting over with a job at a boatyard in a small Maine coastal town not far from where his uncle had lived. It was entry-level work involving sanding hulls and painting decks, but he said it felt honest in a way his previous life never had. He needed to be near the ocean, he explained, to understand the environment that had captivated Harrison so completely. Wolfe listened with his eyes half closed, fingers laced over his middle. Robert reached into his coat and produced a small leather-bound diary, worn at the corners and filled with Harrison's careful handwriting. He had found it among the personal effects the lawyers had finally released and had spent the past week reading his uncle's private thoughts, searching for some explanation of why Harrison had tolerated his neglect and foolishness without cutting him off entirely. He had found an entry dated 2 years earlier, written after one of Robert's rare visits to the Lighthouse. Harrison had observed that his nephew possessed a quick mind and a good heart, but was suffocating under the weight of easy expectations and shallow ambitions. He had written that he hoped someday the boy would find a storm strong enough to strip away the varnish and reveal the wood beneath. Robert looked at Wolfe and said he supposed the storm had finally come, though it had cost his uncle his life to summon it. Wolfe unlaced his fingers and regarded the young man with unusual attention. He observed that many men spent their entire lives polishing varnish and never discovering the wood at all. To find one's own substance, even through tragedy, was a rare achievement. Harrison had been a man of discernment, and if he had seen potential in his nephew, it was likely because it existed. The job at the boatyard, Wolfe suggested, might prove a more valuable inheritance than the shipping company ever could have been. Robert placed the diary back in his pocket and offered me his hand. His grip was firmer than I remembered. He thanked us for finding the truth, even though the truth had been painful, then walked out into the snowy afternoon, a solitary figure moving into the wind like a man finally navigating his own course. After he left, Wolfe poured 2 glasses of beer, an event rare enough to be noteworthy. He pushed one toward me, and we sat in comfortable silence while snow continued to fall outside. I commented that it was strange how a case that started with a dead millionaire and a missing spice jar had ended with a marketing consultant sanding boats in Maine. I asked if he thought Robert would stick with it or eventually return to city life. Wolfe drank thoughtfully before replying that predictions about human behavior were as unreliable as New England weather forecasts. However, he noted, Harrison Blackwood had been an expert observer of both. If the uncle had believed the nephew capable of weathering storms, it would be presumptuous to disagree. He picked up his book, a treatise on Mediterranean trade routes, and found his place. The office settled into evening quiet, with traffic sounds muted by snow and the solid walls that separated Wolfe's carefully controlled environment from the chaos beyond. Fritz appeared to announce that dinner would feature a cassoulet prepared using techniques from Harrison's recipe journal, and the aroma suggested he had been conducting further experiments with the bequeathed ingredients. We proceeded to the dining room where civilization's more reliable satisfactions awaited our attention. Over dinner, Wolfe observed that Harrison Blackwood had understood something fundamental about the relationship between houses and minds. A man's dwelling, he explained, was his philosophy made visible in stone and wood. Harrison had chosen height, isolation, and windows facing the sea, with room for instruments and records, but little else. That told you exactly what he valued: observation, precision, and the kind of solitude that allowed clear thinking. I suggested that this philosophy had gotten Harrison killed, which seemed like a significant disadvantage. Wolfe replied that dying while defending principles was preferable to living while abandoning them, though he personally preferred defending principles from a comfortable chair while others took physical risks. This was why he employed assistants, he noted with satisfaction. The evening concluded with brandy in the office, where Wolfe returned to his reading and I caught up on neglected correspondence. The brownstone had returned to its familiar rhythms of orchids, meals, and the comfortable illusion that the outside world existed primarily as a source of interesting problems and exceptional ingredients. Outside, the city continued its restless activity, but inside there was order, warmth, and the satisfaction of having preserved something worth preserving. Before heading upstairs, I paused to observe Wolfe absorbed in his book, a glass of brandy at his elbow and the saffron jar visible on his desk where it had taken permanent residence. The case was closed, justice had been served, and civilization had been maintained for another day through the combined efforts of a dead man's integrity and a living man's intelligence. Harrison Blackwood's Lighthouse continued its silent watch over gray Atlantic waters, no longer occupied by its original guardian, but preserved as testimony to his commitment. And in a brownstone on West 35th Street, the business of living continued with all its appetites and complications, secure in the knowledge that some things were indeed worth defending, whether they were rare spices or rarer principles. February arrived with its usual collection of broken resolutions and frozen sidewalks, and life at the brownstone resumed its familiar rhythms with the reliable precision of Fritz's meals and Wolfe's orchid schedule. The Blackwood file had moved from the active drawer to the closed case cabinet, where it joined other memorials to human folly we had catalogued over the years. The headlines about Lighthouse murders had faded to occasional mentions of upcoming federal trials. But for us, the case had become another completed chapter, filed under jobs done and fees collected. One gray afternoon, when winter had lost its novelty and become merely tedious, Fritz appeared with the mail while I was pretending to organize correspondence. Among the usual bills and advertisements was a package from Maine, addressed in careful handwriting I recognized from Robert Blackwood's final visit. Inside was a photograph of the lighthouse taken from the water, showing the white tower standing against a brilliant winter sky, and a brief note from the Maritime Research Station explaining they had discovered additional materials during renovation. The envelope they enclosed was addressed to Nero Wolfe in Harrison's distinctive script, hidden behind a loose stone in the lighthouse gallery, where only someone intimately familiar with the building would think to look. The letter was dated 2 days before Harrison's death, beginning with an acknowledgement that if Wolfe was reading this, his precautions had proven insufficient, but his planning had succeeded. Harrison wrote that he had spent 15 years believing observation and documentation were sufficient contributions to an ordered world. He had discovered too late that bearing witness sometimes required more active participation, and that evidence without courage was useless. He had chosen the saffron jar specifically because a man who appreciated quality in small things would possess the attention to detail necessary for complex problems. It was his way of selecting his own investigator from beyond the grave. Wolfe read the letter twice before folding it carefully into his desk drawer. After a long silence, He observed that Harrison had been correct about the relationship between small appreciations and large capabilities. A man who couldn't distinguish good saffron from mediocre would prove equally undiscriminating in matters of evidence and justice. I asked what that made us in this whole arrangement. Wolfe considered the question while Fritz appeared to collect empty glasses, moving with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose cassoulet had secured employment for another decade. Fritz paused to regard the saffron jar and murmured that such quality was no longer produced. Wolfe agreed, noting that the modern world excelled at volume but was increasingly incompetent at character. "We were not relics," Wolfe finally replied, "but curators. A museum does not mourn the past, but protects it, so the future has reliable standards against which to measure its inevitable failures." Harrison Blackwood had been a man of intense flavors in a bland age, and preserving his final message was simply another day's work in maintaining civilization's more fragile achievements. That evening, Fritz prepared bouillabaisse, using the last precious threads of Harrison's saffron, filling the brownstone with Mediterranean warmth against February's chill. As we sat down to dinner, Wolfe raised his glass in silent tribute to a man who had understood that civilization's preservation required attention to both principles and details, and who had trusted that combination to outlive him and complete his work. Spring had arrived in New York with its usual mixture of promise and construction noise, and the brownstone had settled back into the comfortable rhythms that meant winter's siege was over and life could resume its more agreeable complications. It was close to midnight on a warm evening in late April, and I was finishing the last of the paperwork while Wolfe sat behind his desk with an empty beer glass and the satisfied expression of a man whose digestion was proceeding without incident. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the office held that heavy, earned silence that comes when justice has been served, and the bank balance reflects appropriate compensation for services rendered. The mail that morning had brought a letter from Robert Blackwood, postmarked from his coastal Maine town and written in the careful script of someone who had learned to value precision over speed. He reported that the boatyard had promoted him to assistant foreman, that he had purchased a small cottage with a view of the water, and that he had been invited to join the board of the Maritime Research Station operating from Harrison's Lighthouse. The transformation was remarkable. 6 months earlier, he had been a desperate heir, drowning in debt and deception, and now he was earning his living with his hands while helping preserve his uncle's legacy through programs that trained young people in navigation and seamanship. Wolfe had studied the letter with what might have been approval before filing it with the case materials. He observed that Harrison Blackwood's final investment had paid unexpected dividends, converting inherited weakness into earned strength through the simple expedient of honest labor and genuine responsibility. It was, he noted, a more fitting memorial than any foundation or monument could provide, and considerably more useful to society than another marketing consultant with flexible ethics. I remarked that we had played a small role in that transformation by exposing the truth that destroyed Robert's comfortable illusions about easy money and family loyalty. Wolfe pushed his lips out and in, a sign that he was considering the philosophical implications of our intervention. He replied that destruction was often the prerequisite for construction, and that our contribution had been merely clearing obstacles that prevented natural growth. Harrison had planted the seed with his meticulous observations and documented evidence. We had simply ensured the ground was properly prepared for germination. The evening had concluded with Fritz serving spring lamb, accompanied by one of the remaining bottles from Harrison's bequeathed collection, a vintage that would have justified considerably more dramatic circumstances than a quiet dinner in the brownstone. As we raised our glasses, Wolfe offered his final observation about the case that had brought a lighthouse keeper's message to its intended audience. He said that Harrison Blackwood had understood something fundamental about the relationship between solitude and obligation. A man could withdraw from the world's noise without abandoning his responsibilities to civilization. From his isolated tower, Harrison had maintained better watch over human decency than most people managed from the center of crowded cities. Now, with the case files locked away and the evening settling into its familiar quiet, I stood and stretched, telling Wolfe I was heading upstairs. He grunted acknowledgement without looking up from his book, a treatise on Mediterranean trade routes that would probably inspire Fritz's menu planning for the next month. I paused at the office door and observed that for a case involving a silent lighthouse, we had certainly generated considerable noise in the process of solving it. Wolfe murmured that lighthouses were designed to warn travelers of dangerous waters, a function he performed daily from his desk, though his warnings were usually ignored until after the shipwreck. I pointed out that at least lighthouses didn't charge fees or demand fresh beer every afternoon. He replied that lighthouses also didn't solve murders or appreciate Fritz's bouillabaisse, which made them distinctly inferior companions despite their admirable dedication to duty. The brownstone settled into night silence. But it was the good kind of silence that comes when order has been restored and principles have prevailed over profit. Outside, the city continued its restless activity, but inside there was satisfaction, security, and the knowledge that somewhere on the main coast, Harrison's lighthouse continued its watch over grey waters, its beacon now tended by people who understood that some things were worth defending, regardless of personal cost. In Wolfe's carefully maintained universe, that represented civilization functioning exactly as it should, with intelligence and integrity triumphant over corruption and chaos through the simple expedient of paying attention to quality in all things, whether rare spices or rarer principles.